All right, we'll get rolling.
I think so, stuff.
Okay, so welcome to this session that's going to talk a little bit about the Microsoft Cloud ecosystem. So first, how many folks in the room don't have some exposure to the Microsoft Cloud today? Yeah, like, do you not rely on like a business partner that uses Exchange Online? Do you not rely on Azure Active Directory in some way? So, okay, and so the analysts say that 95% of enterprises have some exposure to Microsoft's cloud in some way. So that means that whether you got drug in kicking and screaming from a security perspective, or it was some strategic decision, you're there. Now, unfortunately, most security teams did not staff up to be able to have the appropriate skills and experience to make sure that you've hardened that environment to the maximum extent. And so what I'm going to talk about, the talk has moved a little bit over the last few weeks because our team actually discovered some vulnerabilities in Microsoft Teams. And so I'm going to dig into that, and we'll go into some specifics there. But I'm also going to talk a little bit about some of the skills and abilities that you need to think about how do you go about hardening the environment, what kinds of investments you make to do threat hunting so that you can go and look for threats and problems inside of that environment. And we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end as well. So who am I? I'm Aaron Turner. I've been doing some form of cybersecurity for more than 3 decades now. My lucky break happened, well, I had 2 lucky breaks happen in my life. Number 1, I got caught doing some stuff I shouldn't have back in the early 1990s. And I got given a choice. It was like, either help the feds or maybe do some prison time. I was like, I'm going to help you guys. And so I helped out law enforcement, started a long-term partnership with them that's proven to be very fruitful in many of the research endeavors that I've done over my life. Then my second lucky break happened in the late 1990s. I was hired to work for a little company called Microsoft. And it was right when Microsoft was changing between the NT4 stack and the Windows 2000 stack. So I got to go along for the ride to help invent things like Active Directory and Windows Update and many of those things, BitLocker, a lot of the technologies that were fundamental in changing the trajectory of where Microsoft ended up. And as a result of some of that work, I got an award from Mr. Gates, and so got to do some interesting work there. Later, after I had spent significant time, 8 years at Microsoft, I was invited to join a cyber warfare team. And I actually got paid by the US government to blow stuff up, like Mythbusters style, out on the Idaho desert, working for the Idaho National Laboratory. So I got to do a couple of years there, and that was very useful to basically expand to say, okay, I've gone to try to develop security controls like Active Directory. What can I do to develop cyber weapons to break those controls? So sort of, the opposite side of the brain. And that was interesting there. In 2008, I left my government position, and I just basically became a mercenary. And for the last 14 years, I've done the things that I like to do. I've worked in over 90 countries around the world for most of the United States allies. I've done things, everything from helping to detect credit card skimmers in gas pumps to finding rogue cell towers in Dubai to all sorts of things. And so the trajectory that I've been on is I always try to look for where are the most interesting and vulnerable targets, and how can I help harden those targets in a way that makes a meaningful difference for defenders. And so the latest project that I worked on was called Syrix. Syrix was the first Microsoft 365 vulnerability scanner. So think of it as we have Tenable or Qualys or Rapid7 to scan the IP addresses in your on-prem environment. Well, what are you doing to scan for vulnerabilities in your Microsoft Cloud environment? Are you scanning Exchange Online with Tenable? You can't do that because it's just one big fat IP address for all of the Exchange users out there. And so I invented the first vulnerability scanner for infrastructure as code in the Microsoft Cloud environment. And I did that in April of 2020. In January of this year, Vectra purchased my company, and now we're part of the Vectra portfolio known as Vectra Protect. And it looks like we've got some people who are trying to get in. Door's open, so maybe they just didn't want to come in. All right, so when you think about that Microsoft Cloud environment, when you go out there and start moving, most of the time people took a ready, fire, aim approach to Microsoft Cloud, not a ready, aim, fire one. And this shows in some of the data that we've gotten from the research we've done around the vulnerabilities and the incidents that have taken place in this environment. So if we take a look here, and this is from 120 Microsoft 365 enterprises over the course of 18 months, 56% of those 120 organizations suffered from an Exchange protocol abuse vulnerability in Exchange Online. Well, what does that mean? That means that you ended up having an Exchange mailbox that may have had IMAP or POP configured. And when you have IMAP configured on Exchange Online, that bypasses your multi-factor authentication requirements, meaning that you don't have to use Microsoft Authenticator. You can just replay a username and password. That's not a good thing. You don't want to disable MFA. And you take a look at some of these other ones, external team social engineering, e-discovery exfiltration. 53% of the tenants that we were looking at, that attackers use the e-discovery function to exfiltrate data out of the environment. So basically the hackers are using your e-discovery function to take stuff out. Azure Active Directory legacy protocol abuse, unauthorized Azure AD accounts, DLL hijacking in the Microsoft 365 application stack, and then unauthorized download activity from OneDrive. Now we've also seen that download activity be forced as a ransomware delivery mechanism from OneDrive into your on-premise environment. So these are not minor numbers, right? Out of 120 organizations, half of them are suffering from these kinds of incidents. This shows us that most organizations have not hardened their Microsoft environment to protect them from these kinds of attacks. So let's take a look at the last 90 days. It has been a brutal time for Microsoft 365 customers. So first, our team, we discovered a vulnerability in Microsoft Teams. We responsibly disclosed that vulnerability to Microsoft. They decided not to patch it. And so we'll talk a little bit about what does that mean for Microsoft Teams users. We've seen another security research went out and found a way to use OneDrive to deliver ransomware in a very interesting way. So they'll go and decrease the number of versions that OneDrive is keeping to 1, and then they'll encrypt that one version, and now your entire OneDrive is encrypted and you have to pay for it. And then we saw another researcher at Black Hat disclose a business email compromise vulnerability and how to take over other people's Outlook email. And so this is a very rich ecosystem where attackers and researchers are finding more and more vulnerabilities that are out there. And so let's take a look from a geopolitical perspective. What do these Microsoft 365 vulnerabilities mean? In February of this year, the US Department of Homeland Security issued this alert, AA22047A, super easy to remember. But that alert basically stated that Exchange Online vulnerabilities were being used by Russians to interrupt the delivery of ammunition and supplies into Ukraine. So they actually issued an alert to US defense contractors saying, you need to harden Exchange Online so that you don't have your operations interrupted to deliver material into the Ukraine conflict. And so these vulnerabilities are not just theoretical, as we saw from the first slide. These are actual problems that are out there. And the trajectory is not good. Microsoft has stated from March of 2020, when they publicly acknowledged that 12 tenants had been compromised as a result of the SolarWinds exploit, they have now admitted over 300,000 organizations have had their tenants compromised because of weak default settings in the environment. So this is a significant problem in the ecosystem. So why has this happened? What is the root cause of these problems? When you go and set up Microsoft 365, each user creates a user manifest with over 7,000 settings in it. So even in a small tenant, like 100 users, 100 times 7,000, that's 700,000 settings that need to be managed. And that is overwhelming for most organizations. They're already swimming in the sea of technological debt from all of the on-prem stuff they're dealing with, let alone this explosion of complexity and lack of documentation when it comes to the Microsoft Cloud environment. And how many folks in here have tried to actually manage the security settings out there in Microsoft? People done it? Okay, what tool did you have to use to do it? Okay, so really important comment that he just made. You can't go to one place. You can go to the portal for some of it, but for other parts, you have to use this lovely user interface that was designed in 1980. This is not a fun place to be. This is good old-fashioned PowerShell. And PowerShell can be a very complex thing to go and do. It's almost like a programming language. It has a certain syntax that you have to use to go and discover things. And if that syntax is not properly used, you can fry security settings in ways that actually makes the situation worse. And so because of the lack of documentation, because these are fairly obscure controls, most people go, I don't have time. I need to go do something else. So as a result, those settings are left in a weak default configuration. And then Microsoft, the attackers basically see those weak default configurations as entry points. So when you all set up your Microsoft tenants to go and you're using either Exchange Online or Teams or OneDrive or whatever the Microsoft services you're using, you had to configure a text record inside of your DNS settings. And so the mere act of setting up Microsoft 365 has left behind publicly attributable data from your text record that tells an attacker that you're using it. So that's sort of like a flag going up, okay. So I did a quick look of the registrants from companies that are attending today, and I found that 9 out of 10 of those organizations are using Microsoft Cloud. And so I could just do that from a simple DNS lookup. So let's talk a little bit about how attackers leverage this to automate their entire attack sequence. So this eye chart here is the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And it's not meant that you have to read every cell here. I'm using it more of just a graphical representation. But for those who aren't familiar, the MITRE ATT&CK framework is basically the timeline of how an attacker goes about their activities. And so you start here with reconnaissance on the left, and you end up with data exfiltration on the right. Now, every one of these red cells represents an attack pattern that can be scripted by an attacker that focuses on Microsoft 365. So that means that every red cell can be a robotic process automation that an attacker can use to attack your environment. So if the attackers are using robotic process automation to attack you, maybe you should look at using robotic process automation to automate your defense. You should probably be looking at ways to at least write recurring scripts through PowerShell that assure the baseline configurations in the environment. Now, we've seen these used all the way from March of 2020 when the SolarWinds attackers used these to automate the attack against the US Treasury. So the Russians wanted to know what the Secretary of the Treasury was going to do about the pandemic response from an economic perspective. And so what the Russians did is they used the SolarWinds on-prem attack supply chain to then go and pivot into Microsoft 365. They took over the Secretary of the Treasury's inbox and captured every single email that he was sending and receiving. And that was one of the ways the Russians gained as much insight as they did about the way the US government was going to interact with the international financial system. So from that time in March of 2020, all the way through the Hafnium and Nobelium attacks that are still going on today, this has been automated. And we see this as a really interesting indicator of compromise. And if you see certain tool marks left in your environment, then you can know that these automated attacks have gone down. At the end of the presentation, I'll talk about a free tool that we're offering the community that you can use to scan your environment to look for these tool marks. And we're more than happy to help you run that. Now, one of the key things you have to do, whether you're hardening the environment or getting ready to threat hunt, the Microsoft 365 backend is not a monolith. It is a conglomeration of a lot of stuff that's out there. And so if you take a look here, Microsoft talks about the Graph API as this magical thing that does everything. It doesn't. The Microsoft 365 backend is a conglomeration of over 12 different PowerShell modules, and it coincides with the Graph API in an interesting way, but you have to think about it as all of those modules put together. So for example, MSOL, MS Online, is a PowerShell module that keeps track of your MFA and self-service password reset functions. So that's where you need to go looking to see if someone's trying to mess with MFA bypass attacks. But you can see that that's separate from Azure Active Directory. So if you wanted to do a holistic look, you've got to query Azure AD to get all of your active users. You would then query MSOL to look for what the MFA bypass situation is. And then you would go to Azure RM to put it together to see if all of that has actually happened. So this becomes a very complex task to piece all of that together. And so when you think about it from a hardening perspective, you really have to watch for the waterfall effect among all of these things too. So for example, in Microsoft Teams, if you leave it turned on by default, every time someone shares a file through Microsoft Teams, it creates a SharePoint site that inherits the permissions of that Microsoft Teams meeting. So for example, let's say we have 4 or 5 people, outside parties, they're in a Teams meeting, the outside party shares a file through Teams, that file is now in a SharePoint site that has inherited the permissions of the Teams meeting, and because it was an outside party, that's essentially an anonymous access SharePoint site, because it's an outside party, not someone inside of the organization. And so it's that transitive trust that ends up killing a lot of folks when it comes to the Microsoft environment. Now, let's talk a little bit about digging into the PowerShell and Graph API. Unfortunately, the screen is not very big here. I'm hoping that John has a mechanism by which you can get these slides. I'm more than happy to share them. But basically, think about each one of these as major domains that you have to think about almost a different language that you interact with them, both from a hardening perspective as well as a threat hunting perspective. Now, some of these, for legacy Microsoft administrators, they are very similar to SharePoint on-prem, when it comes to SharePoint Online and OneDrive, and Exchange on-prem when it comes to Exchange Online. But there are other aspects of this. For example, when it comes to connecting, let's say, for example, to the Microsoft Teams Graph API component, you actually have to use the old Skype PowerShell module, funnel your command through the Skype PowerShell module to get to the Graph API for Microsoft Teams. So you actually have to learn 2 languages to go threat hunting inside of Microsoft Teams. Some of the other things that are interesting, let's see here. When it comes to, I already talked about MSOL, about doing the MFA bypass detection, but also one of the things that we look at when we run our vulnerability scans in Azure Active Directory is how many factors of authentication do you need for self-service password reset? So what we've seen happen over the last 6 months is when you turn on Azure Active Directory by default, the self-service password reset allows people to reset their password, right? Well, if you only have one factor of authentication turned on, what we've seen happen is the attackers will pop an iOS vulnerability. They'll take over the person's email on their phone, their Outlook client. They will then go do the self-service password reset. They only have one factor of authentication for the password reset. They'll do it 2 o'clock in the morning while the person is laying in bed, and then the bad guy has 6 hours to dump everything they want out of the email account before someone wakes up and says, someone's reset my password, what's going on here? And then essentially they take it over again. And so it's those kinds of tool marks and vulnerability sets that you should be thinking about how you're going to harden. So if we think about prioritizing service hardening, up until this year, I would say Exchange was by far and away #1, just because of the amount of information that was there between attachments, internal sensitive communications, that sort of thing. But Microsoft claims that there's 120 million users on Exchange Online. Anyone know the latest number for Teams? 310 million users on Teams now. Right? So order of magnitude greater. So what happens? What do attackers do? They go to the watering hole. They hang out where everyone else is hanging out. 310 million users on Teams, that's a fraction of a billion people. And so if you can develop exploits for Teams, then that is a very great place to start with an attack. So in my opinion, I think Teams has probably become the place that you should focus on to harden. And I'll talk about the vulnerability we discovered and why that's more important now. I think OneDrive is rapidly escalating to become #2 because what we've seen with the number of ransomware attacks where folks have been attacked using OneDrive as the ransomware delivery mechanism, I think that's so what Exchange was #1, but because of the escalation of Teams and OneDrive, I think Exchange has been eclipsed. Now, it's all important, right? I don't know if you listened to David Etchew's talk this morning, but David was talking about, how do you go about making yourself a harder target? You improve all of this stuff, right? You need to make sure you go about doing it. But anyone has limited resources. For what do you do first? I'd focus on Teams. So some quick tips that you can use for hardening Exchange and OneDrive. So we've got a situation where a lot of times people are not focusing on strong multi-factor authentication for their admins. So think about your Exchange admins in the organization. an organization of 1,000 people, sometimes they'll have 5 or 6 people who have Exchange admin rights, just because of redundancy and administrative help and that sort of thing. Well, how many folks are really watching to make sure that the device that Microsoft Authenticator on is really patched? In the last month, iOS has had to have 2 0 days fixed. And both of those 0 days were in response to situations where Microsoft Authenticator had been compromised because of an iOS exploit. And so that's where, if I'm in your shoes, I'm going to get all of my Exchange admins put onto YubiKeys. Eliminate the use of Microsoft Authenticator for administrators and just move to a hardware token. And that way, it's a non-phishable, non-connected multi-factor token. It takes the difficulty from a level of 0 to a level of 10. If you're going to go about doing that. So I think that's a very strategic thing around improving MFA for Exchange admins. You want to make sure you're constantly checking to make sure that legacy protocols are being blocked. You should have a global conditional access policy that blocks IMAP and POP, because there's no good reason why IMAP and POP should be used anymore. There's really no justifiable reason why those protocols should still be turned on. Now, what the attackers have done is they've figured it out to say, okay, let's say they do get a hold of one of your Exchange admin accounts because of weak MFA. What they will do is they'll go and create a conflicting conditional access policy that allows IMAP and then move users into that conditional access policy. So not only do you need to make sure that one conditional access policy is there, but you need to make sure the attackers have not deployed a conflicting conditional access policy that could revert that legacy policy setting. And then we talked about the usage of e-discovery. You should monitor the daylights out of e-discovery. We have seen dozens of attacks using e-discovery as the mechanism where attackers will log into e-discovery, program in their search terms, because what does e-discovery do? It allows you to create those legal holds, looking for sensitive data, for legal responses. The attackers will code their response there, e-discovery packages it all up, and then we've seen them use Power Automate to exfiltrate the e-discovery package. So they basically build a time wrap inside of Power Automate that as soon as the e-discovery task is finished, it'll send it off to a Google Drive or Box or somewhere else. So you want to look for those automations that are being used in the Power Platform in conjunction with the e-discovery platform as well. On the OneDrive and SharePoint hardening, you want to make sure that you're constantly monitoring for version control settings. So if you see all of your OneDrive files get set to a version control of 1, that's a bad day. Because by default, there should be 5. And so 5 basically says someone makes a change 5 times and you can revert back to that document over the course of 5 revisions. Well, if someone sets it to 1, there's usually only one reason why it's set to 1 is because ransomware is inbound. And so that should serve as a really good early warning indicator that someone has not only compromised your OneDrive, but is getting ready to deploy a large-scale ransomware attack against your organization. Ensure that malicious file type blocking remains enabled. A lot of times we'll see the bad guys come in, they'll flip off malicious file type blocking because they don't want the OneDrive engine to block the ransomware dropper mechanism. And then monitor for rapid file writes and massive data exports. This is something that you can do using the Defender tools inside of the Microsoft suite. You can also use your third-party user behavior analytics stuff, like if you've got the Splunk plugin for Microsoft 365 or if you're using Sentinel workbooks, you can write workbooks that will look for these massive data dumps. They are usually, when you see a massive data dump, one of 2 reasons. You've got a disgruntled employee who's about ready to leave the building, or you're suffering from one of the North Korean ransomware attacks where they're usually doing an intellectual property dump before they run the ransomware. The North Koreans are better about capturing the data before they encrypt it, and they usually end up selling it to the Chinese government. And so you could be on the front end of an IP theft situation.
Is this telemetry available in Event Hub?
So if you're a Splunk customer, Event Hub is the only way to ingest it into Splunk. But if you're not a Splunk customer, you don't need to use Event Hub. You can just use a Sentinel workbook to do this. Good question.
Well, there's more than Splunk and Sentinel. But...
Well, you could also do something interesting in Chronicle. So Google Chronicle has some tooling that you can use there as well.
Well, I mean, we're already getting stuff from Event Hub. I assume if we're getting stuff from Event Hub, we're getting this too.
Yep, you'll just want to make sure that the auditing and logging functions are properly configured to feed it into Event Hub, because by default, many of these things are not ingested there.
Got it.
Yep. Good question. By the way, I've just flooded you guys with a ton of information. Any other questions about anything we've covered so far? Death by fire hose. Yeah, Bob.
You know, I would make a comment, more comment than a question. You know, I was working with a client last year that needed some bailing out due to a significant ransomware attack. And you know, a couple things that you're pointing out right here would have minimized the damage. One of them is having multi-factor authentication for admin accounts, which they didn't have. And the other aspect of it was business continuity and disaster recovery were non-existent. And I don't think that they were monitoring anything at all with respect to SharePoint and OneDrive. You know, just getting in and taking over the admin account allowed them to move laterally and do some really interesting things. And,
what that is the result, in my opinion, that situation as well as the dozens I've seen is because the CIO who made the decision to move to the Microsoft cloud did not truly understand the shared responsibility model that is the Microsoft cloud.
Yep.
And as a result, they're like, oh, Microsoft's got my back. What's the likelihood that Exchange Online is going to go down? Yeah. Well, very low. But the likelihood that your Exchange Online tenant can be disrupted is pretty high. Yeah. And so you've got to make those investments as appropriate. Yeah. Great comment, Bob. Appreciate you sharing that.
No worries.
So let's dig into Teams. So Teams has a really interesting and complex security model. Number one, we're at a CornCon event that's the Matrix, right? So I'm going to use a Matrix reference here. Teams is like a virus, okay? If we think about the first Matrix movie. And the reason why Teams is like a virus is because it was invented to, let's say you're using the iOS Teams client and you install a Teams app on the iOS Teams client on your iPhone. Well, it self-replicates to your desktop Teams client. And it will self-replicate to your web's Teams client. So now you have this really interesting malware delivery mechanism that can go across clients. So I think that's an interesting wrinkle that most people don't understand that Teams does, is it can be a cross-platform process delivery mechanism. Now, that means the malicious app could do damage across all of those installed platforms. So whether it's the desktop or the iOS device or the web app, whatever. It's an open architecture, which means that all enterprise users trust guests and external users in this environment. By default, it is an open architecture, and they did that to mimic what Zoom does. But the critical difference between what Teams is and what Zoom does, Zoom doesn't have an Azure Active Directory identity that can be replayed against other services. Right, so there's the critical difference between why this is a big deal in Teams and why it's not a big deal in Zoom. And there's very little auditing and logging enabled by default to track interactions. You have to go through and flip bits to make sure that you're getting the telemetry you need. Now, also, Teams has an app store. I don't know if you've seen this app store. You can go and you can install things like transcribers and bots and different things that can do automations inside of your Teams app. Well, by default, so Microsoft has done a good job where they look for latent malware inside of the applications themselves. But they don't check to make sure that the API calls are clean. They don't check to make sure that the data is being protected in transit. They don't check to see if the data is encrypted at rest on the other API. They basically are just doing a quick static analysis to make sure that binary is not blatantly malicious. So, what an interesting environment from an attacker perspective, right? Cross-platform, open architecture, everyone trusts each other. So this is the graphic that really starts to boggle my brain. And this is a graphic that Microsoft publishes as part of their Teams developer architecture. And so you can see here we've got the web client, the desktop client that's written in Electron, and that's important. We'll get back to that in a moment. iOS and Android apps, and then the Microsoft Graph API. But if you take a look at this spaghetti factory here, okay? The number of lines should concern you. You're giving someone access to OneDrive shares in ways that you're not really monitoring or logging above and beyond their simple Azure Active Directory credential. In some cases, people have actually tapped Teams into their public telephone system. So in large, complex environments, they have voicemail on your desktop phone that's integrated into your Teams experience. We've seen situations where bad guys have compromised Teams, and then they'll do a calling card scam. So there's still parts of the world that use calling cards. And they'll sell calling cards that broker access into Teams, and then the long distance call is made from the Teams environment. Right? So it's a good way to, if you're looking to make a couple of bucks and you want to sell calling cards in a third world country, just compromise a business's Teams environment. And then you can monetize all the calling cards you want and sell long distance access there. So also, you think about where the data sits. This is another spaghetti factory. So these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, these 8 lines represent the different places where Teams data is stored. So when the data is stored in this many different locations, it's hard when you go try to figure out if someone accessed it in an unauthorized way or if the data has integrity or whatever. And so this is something that most people don't understand because they're just like, oh, the Teams data just sits inside of one place. It doesn't. And so it's really important. If you don't leave here with anything else, you should ask yourself the question, do my incident responders understand where all of this data is? Because at a minimum, you should be knowing where to go look for data, because we're seeing Teams being used both as social engineering mechanism as well as malware delivery mechanism. And the only way to do the incident response is you've got to understand all of these data types and where the data is stored. Now, isn't it interesting how when someone develops a really rich interactive platform like Teams, there's all sorts of unintended consequences. So when you interact with people in Teams, has anyone ever send you like an animated winky face, that goes like, okay, happy, my boss is a jerk, winky face, or whatever you might be messaging to someone. So when that winky face goes off, it actually calls a third-party API that's not under Microsoft's control, right? So it can be a really interesting beaconing mechanism to go, is this person really online? Like what's going on here? There have been several researchers over the last couple of months that have showed that not only can Giphies be beaconing mechanisms, but Giphies can be malware delivery mechanisms as well. So I can push a Giphy to you where the mere preview of the Giphy becomes an exploit mechanism to take over someone's phone or their Teams desktop or whatever. Now, the URL preview mechanism can also be beaconing plus malware delivery as well. And so while typically URL preview is a good thing because you want to make sure someone's understanding what they're going to click on, the way that URL previews are handled in Teams right now can also be a malicious website delivery mechanism as well. And so there's some bite to that. Now, what we ended up doing over the course of the last several months, when the Black Hat announcement came out, the folks who'd been doing some Electron research in the Microsoft Teams desktop app, myself and Connor Peoples at Vectra, we sat down and said, what's the worst thing we could do? Like, now that we understand that this Electron application is sort of out of the horse is out of the barn, what's the worst thing we could do? And the way that I've gone about doing bad things in the past, I told you about some of the work I did for the US government. Once you get privileged credentials, you've got the whole thing, right? Privileged credentials gives you the ability to do things. And this is where I'm on the record backing Mudge, the former CSO of Twitter, saying when you don't have separation of duties for privileged controls, you don't have control over your environment. And so in August of 22, this Microsoft Teams vulnerability where people could basically send code to the Electron app and have it arbitrarily executed was a big deal. Now, that researcher said, start using Teams only through Chrome or Edge as a managed browser experience instead of using the desktop app. Well, just released, we found a Teams token mining vulnerability in Microsoft Teams. What Teams does is when you establish make sure you go find a good trusted Microsoft partner, a Microsoft certified Microsoft 365 administration partner and say, hey, can you help us fix this, right? And that's where, I saw some folks waving hands in the background, maybe certain people are in that business here. If you need some additional help, we've got folks in our ecosystem that are certified to help fix all the stuff we find. Now, to give you an idea of order of magnitude, we ran the scan on a large railroad that has 90,000 users. They've been in the Microsoft tenant for 2.5 years. We discovered over 250,000 misconfigured SharePoint sites in that environment. That resulted in a 1-year project. Now, let's go on the other end of the spectrum. There was a 400-person law firm that ran our scan. As the result of the Panama Papers disclosure, they were one of the victims of what happened with that Panama Papers situation. When that went down, they scanned, and that resulted in about 80 hours of professional services work that they contracted with a third party to do that. And so that's where they were able to basically go lean in with that partner, get the vulnerability solved over the course of several weeks, and then they could operate in a much better hardened situation. So that's what I had prepared for you today. Connect with me on LinkedIn. Happy to share the slides with you there. I'll also be giving them to John so he can send them out. Any questions about things that you'd like to ask now?
What other scanners, are there any other scanners like the Tenable, Rapid7, whatever that scan?
Yeah, right now, our scanner is the only one that's been approved to connect to the Graph API the way that it does in an unthrottled manner. So there are other throttled mechanisms out there. So for example, Zscaler is including something in their CASB product. App Omni is doing something with a connection to just Azure AD. So you'll see folks who have done smaller things, but right now the scanner that we've built is the only Microsoft approved scanner across all of the Microsoft 365 services. Great question. Any other questions about anything we've covered? Thanks for your time and attention, right? And so I love coming to CornCon. I'm from a little town in Idaho, so I'm very passionate about taking this stuff and getting out to sort of more of the rural parts of the world. And so I always love coming to CornCon. Thanks for your attention and engagement. We've got a booth set up, Vectra over here in the exhibitors hall. I'll be over there for the next couple of hours. So if you have some additional questions that you were too afraid to ask in this situation, I'll be over there for the next couple of hours. But thanks again for your time and attention. Take care.